Hi all. So, I'd like to take this opportunity to defend the existence of climate change, that it is caused by people and that we need to do something about it. Now, I kind of feel like I probably shouldn't have to do this, but it seems that there are still plenty of people out there who don't accept that climate is changing, or don't think that we're responsible for it, or don't think we should do anything about it either. So, to start off with, I'd like to consider an analogy. So imagine that tomorrow you wake up and all over the news it's been announced that astronomers have discovered that the planet Earth, and in fact our whole solar system, is about to go through a massive meteor field. That in a few years' time, astronomers have discovered this massive meteor field outside of the solar system that our solar system is moving towards. And that within a few years, these asteroids will sweep through the solar system and start impacting upon the Earth in potentially catastrophic manner. The question really here is, would you believe what these astronomers were saying? Now, you read about it in the newspaper, say, or heard it on the news, so you might be a little bit sceptical, and that's fair enough, because a lot of these things tend to be overblown. But let's say that another group of astronomers, so it's not just one group, but another group of astronomers do their own calculations, they do their own little bit of research, and over the coming weeks, they also announce that they've come to the same conclusion, that they also have discovered this asteroid cloud that we're heading towards. And then another group. And then, a few days after that, a little group of astronomers or engineers or mathematicians come out and say that they doubt the methods that the first group had used, and that the second group had written some dodgy writing in some of their emails, and that perhaps the third group had pointed their telescopes deliberately at a piece of sky and had ignored other areas of sky to look at, and that they didn't actually agree. But the vast majority of astronomers, they conclude that we are going to head into this asteroid belt, and it is going to most likely to cause quite damaging destruction to the Earth. The question is, would you believe them? Now, I know nothing about astronomy, and so I'm not in a position to evaluate their methods. I'm not in a position to question the conclusions that they've come to. And this may sound credulous, but given that situation, I feel that the only reasonable approach is to tentatively accept the opinion of the majority of experts. Now, if it was a 50-50 split, and say half the astronomers were saying this was going to happen and half were saying it wouldn't, then in that case it would be much more difficult. But if it's a 97% to 3%, then you would suspect that it's very likely that 3% was simply mistaken, or that their criticisms weren't entirely valid, especially when they're saying that if that 3% is only criticising the methods and not really able to dispute the conclusions or the entirety of the research. Now let's take it a step further. Suppose that for some reason it's discovered that the only way that humanity is going to survive these potentially devastating impacts is to tunnel our way into mountains around the world and create vast underground cities for humanity to live in. And suppose that these mountains were owned by particular countries. So the only mountains in which we could really foreseeably do this is along the Rockies and the Himalayas and perhaps the Urals, or just the massive mountain chains. And these governments didn't really want to have to take in refugees from all around the world. Would you be a little more suspicious now if it turned out that a lot of the astronomers, that small chunk of astronomers who were objecting to the science of the oncoming meteor storm, happened to be paid, at least in part, by the governments of these countries that didn't want to allow refugees from other countries into there? You can see where I'm going with this. Suppose that it turns out this meteor cloud that we're going into has a large sort of sparse amount of meteors before you get to the dense clumping of it in the middle, and that we started to experience a slightly higher rate of meteor impacts as we're heading into the cloud. People may then suggest, well, we've had meteor impacts in the past. We've had times of great meteor impact in the Earth's past that hasn't been catastrophic. And maybe that's all we're going through. Maybe we're just having our natural cycle. You can see what the analogy is. So basically, my question is this. If the overwhelming majority of climate scientists tell us that climate change is real, the climate is changing, and not only that, but the climate is changing primarily, almost entirely because of the carbon and other emissions that humanity has poured into the atmosphere, that is the primary cause for it. If that is what all the climate scientists are saying, apart from a very small minority, then on what rational basis do we discard that? On what rational basis do we argue against that? Especially when we are not experts ourselves. Now, this is not an argument from authority. I'm not saying that we should trust them purely because they are experts. What I'm saying is that as a pragmatic approach is that we do have to defer to experts in cases like this, especially when there is overwhelming consensus. If you are inclined, then you yourself could become an expert. You could take the time to research and study this and become up to date on the latest climate sciences. You could spend 4 years at university, you could probably spend another 4 years postgraduate studying this kind of stuff and come to a point where you could actually criticize climate scientists and have a full understanding of how climate science works. The scary thing is, for me, is that in the few examples I'm aware of where people have actually done that, in an attempt to educate themselves on the climate science, they've taken a vast amount of time and effort to get up to date on it all. They all agree with the consensus. The other side of things is that the only rejection that I have heard people make, the only reasons I've heard people give for not accepting the consensus of the experts sounds eerily similar to the reasons why people rejected the consensus of the experts that we landed on the moon. Or that 9/11, or the justification that people give for rejecting the consensus of the experts that 9/11 was caused by some hijackers from Saudi Arabia under the auspices of Al-Qaeda. The rationalizations seem to be exactly the same, that there must be some kind of conspiracy, that is a orthodoxy and a dogma now that cannot be questioned, that there's a small band of brave climate scientists arguing against it, etc., etc. And so on that basis, I cannot understand why anybody would reject this. Now, if you accept that climate change is happening, that is likely to get far, far worse in the near future, and that the primary driver for it is human activity, then the obvious question is, what is the most effective way to reverse the trend? What is the most effective way to get our climate back into something which is broadly habitable for humanity? And it seems that the consensus here is fairly straightforward, that of the known methods, of the technologies that we have, that we can rely on, that the clear-cut winner in this case is simply to reduce our carbon emissions. So we must reduce the rate at which humanity is pumping carbon emissions and equivalent other pollutants into the atmosphere, and then encourage the natural cycle of carbon dioxide and methane breakdown, etc., through the planting of trees, etc. So there are other engineering ideas that have been floated about, but none which actually are reliable at this point. These are ideas that I think are well worth exploring, but not something that we could possibly rely on. It's like heading into the asteroid field and people saying, well, we could make an anti-gravity beam that would allow us to shield the planet. Sure, that's possible, but I'd hardly like to rely on that as the only hope for humanity when we have a tried and trusted method of digging into rock. Now, if that's the case, if really the only reliable way that we have at the moment of avoiding catastrophic climate change would be to reduce our emissions, the next obvious question is, what is the most efficient method of doing this? Now, this is not actually a scientific question, really. This is a question for the dismal science of economics. And the economists are almost unanimous on this one. Essentially, which is very rare for economists, but essentially everybody agrees that the cheapest way to reduce carbon emissions is through a market-based approach of basically cap and trade, an emissions trading scheme, or a carbon tax. There's sort of disagreement around the edges about how these things work, but essentially the idea that you take what economists would call an externality, that is something that is not normally paid for, a consequence that is not delivered unto a party to a deal. So what we have with pollution is that, generally speaking, when I purchase power from my utility, neither me nor the utility have to suffer the consequences of the pollution, not directly. It's everybody else who suffers. And so what economists would say is you need to make sure that the people who are doing the deal over the power are paying the consequences, are paying for the consequences. That is, you need to make sure that there is some kind of cost involved which reflects the cost of that pollution. Now, whether you want to do it as a tax or a cap and trade or some kind of emissions trading scheme, etc., is down to the finer details. But basically, it seems to me that it's clear cut that if you listen to the experts, and I honestly can't think of any rational reason not to, that climate change is happening, it's caused by us, we need to reduce our emissions, and the cheapest way to do that, that is the way that has the overall least economic impact, is through some kind of carbon tax or emission trading scheme. I cannot understand why people don't agree with this, except for psychological reasons. So the biggest difference between the incoming meteor storm and the climate change example is the incoming meteor storm is not our fault, and it's outside of us. That is, it's out of planet Earth. And because of this, I suspect that actually people would respond much better, because one, they wouldn't feel guilty about it, and two, they would band together against an external threat. And we know that psychologically this is how people tend to work. So if you give people an external threat, that tends to bring groups together. The problem with climate change, psychologically the problem, is that it is something that we've caused. And so there's a reluctance to accept responsibility for that. There's a big desire to push responsibility on everybody else, to say, well, I didn't cause it, I can't have caused this, I'm a good person, so how could I have caused climate change? And secondly, it's an internal threat. So it doesn't rally people together in the same way. People don't go, oh, look, there's an external invader that we need to fight off. It doesn't invoke this war metaphor that people like to use. And the last thing I think that that also plays into this is that, although this is similar with the meteor storm thing, is that it requires cooperative action. So just like in a meteor storm, no one country could go it alone and save the entirety of humanity. Same with climate change. And so what we have is a country like Australia going, well, we can't provide enough underground cities to protect all of our citizens, so what's the point in building any underground cities? And this is the same with climate change. I think that pragmatic problem of how do you get global action on a global problem when you only have governments which are in charge of individual countries, I think is a quite complex one, and I would actually welcome a lot of debate on that, because I think that is an important one to have. But I think that at the moment, all I hear from other people who are arguing against climate change action is a fundamental misunderstanding of the first three problems of whether it's happening, whether we're responsible, and whether reducing carbon emissions would actually help. Anyway, that's my defense of climate change, and this is why I believe that you absolutely, everybody who's listening to this and watching this, should absolutely believe in the science of climate change and should be committed to taking climate action. And this is why I believe that whenever you're making political decisions, because ultimately the most powerful weapon we have in the fight against climate change, if you want to put it into that analogy, is the political leaders and the actions that they're willing to take. And so this is why I think that when we're voting, we should consider very carefully what our governments are going to do, and not get too hung up in the short-term problems that we tend to worry about, because a lot of that will become irrelevant once we head into the meteor cloud and the Earth is bombarded by meteors. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.